want to say first how grateful I am for having arranged this gathering. I think who I am, what I am, will perhaps emerge bit by bit in the course of what I have to say. I must say I was rather intimidated by invited to talk in a university, because the last time I did so was in Adelaide, and it was a very ultra-modern lecture theatre, and they asked me to speak into a microphone, which I don't especially like, and next to the microphone there was a huge battery of switches and dials and knobs, and it was like the control tower at Heathrow Airport. And as I was speaking, I tended to perhaps just gesticulate, and I would touch one of these dials. Then behind me a screen would come up or go down, and I couldn't understand why people were looking so surprised. And at one stage I got rather excited, and I put my hand down or something, and all the lights in the theatre. Anyway, we're rather simpler sort of technological situation here. But I've come to talk about what seems to me the global crisis. I keep hearing this word crisis in Asia in reference to the monetary crisis which is sweeping around the region. I regard this as a mere blip on the historical graph. I think it's probably the prelude to a global economic collapse. I see no logical reason why it should be assumed that the idea that you can go on expanding production forevermore. Somebody said recently in university circles that whatever goes up must come down. And I suppose that must be very true of our economic activity. Well, what is the global crisis when I keep referring to it? To me, it seems to be a compound of a number of factors. One of them is war, another is ecological devastation, another is the abuse of finite resources on the planet, another is the population factor, and perhaps last but not least is the way in which our societies are disintegrating from within. And nothing makes that more manifest than the way our cities have begun to emerge in modern times, looking increasingly alike, with this eruption of what you might call architectural adolescent acne in the shape of these giant structures, as though people are just learning for the first time to play with bricks and mortar, and leaving you with the feeling that in terms of architecture it must have taken us something like 4,000 years to progress from a pyramid to a box. This crisis is challenging all our basic assumptions about organized social life, all of them. And yet, what we are hearing from church leaders, religious leaders, and from the academic world, and almost any sphere where moral or intellectual leadership is supposed to be operating, is nothing but silence. That's what hits me, silence. I think this silence is a form of betrayal. It's a betrayal of whatever religious beliefs we have. It's a betrayal of our civilization. It's a betrayal of our professions. And above all, it's a betrayal of our children. And it can't go on. It'd be very easy to enlarge on the doom and gloom aspects of modern life. I'm not going to do that. What I want to do instead is to ask you, if you will, to consider what are the origins of this crisis. Because if we can't see where we're coming from, then it's obviously going to be not very easy to plot a path as to where we're going or how we get out of the predicament we're in. So let me take you back in history a little. I'm a Christian minister. My background is Christian training and Christian literature, Christian assumptions about life. So if I am saying things which appear discordant to anybody who is not Christian, I apologize. I'm only mentioning these things because it seems to me they have an absolutely vital, they played a vital role in what has brought us to the present state of the last decade of the 20th century, when the fate of our civilization now seems to be hanging in the balance. I know very well it was Gandhi, when he was asked what he thought of Western civilization, he said he thought it would be a very good idea. But in the early part of the 16th century, the boy king, Edward VI, was writing in his day book, "Usury is an odious and detestable vice, as is plainly from the Holy Gospels to be seen." This was a boy king shortly to die, because he was a very weak, physically weakling. But he was writing that, echoing the general mind frame of people around him, that usury was an odious and detestable vice. It's an understanding, it's a moral statement, if you like, which is fully echoed in Jewish literature and Muslim literature. All three, these major religions, are saying that usury is immoral. Now, the 16th century was a turning point in world history, simply because, although it happened in England, England at that time was at the forefront of a lot of the developments that have helped to create the modern world. And before the end of the 16th century, all the laws against usury, against paying interest on money, we're all clear what usury is, are we? Were abolished. They were wiped off the statute book. And this was one of the great turning points in human history. You see, for 1500 years, the church fathers, the early schoolmen, going back centuries ago, and bear in mind, we're talking about a period of time that's 3/4 of the time that separates us from the birth of Christ, were warning us about the dangers and the evils of usury. And if you could summarize their teaching, I think you could say that it would be summed up by saying that if you allow the force of money to multiply itself, if you allow that to happen, instead of society and the moral framework of society controlling market forces, you would end up with a situation in which market forces would control the moral and social framework of society. And after more than 400 years of that change, I think we're in some sort of position to estimate the validity of those warnings. And I'm sure those warnings were probably echoed in both Jewish and Muslim literature. What happened was that with the increase of the improvements of navigation at the time was leading to an expansion of trade, and this was abetted by the influx of gold from the so-called New World. And there was then an increase in supply and an increased demand for capital, which in those days was expressed in gold, and it made the forces against usury, the legal prohibition, unrealistic, because like smoking marijuana today, lots and lots of people were doing it, and it was no longer enforceable. The forces of the market, of course, were starting out on a career of expansion, a career of development. a career that was going to link them with technology, and it took them to another great turning point in human history in 1812. 1812, for a lot of people, signifies, at least in European terms, the retreat of Napoleon's armies from Moscow. To some with a musical bent, it may signify Tchaikovsky's marvelous 1812 overture. But it was also the year of the defeat of the Luddites. The Luddites, who were they? Luddites were ordinary, simple, English working people who were following a mythical figure named King Lud. They went around breaking machines because the machines were displacing them from work. Machines being introduced on farms and factories being built to do spinning and weaving, which previously had been done by master weavers and master spinners in their homes. They suddenly found that instead of being masters of their work, they were appendages to work if they had any work at all. The struggle they put up brought England to the verge of civil war. The British government was using more troops and spending more money in putting down the Luddites in 1812 than it had spent in the previous decade against the Napoleonic forces in the Peninsular Wars. If you want to read up a modern interpretation which for the first time is sympathetic about the Luddite situation, I can't commend to you too highly Kirkpatrick Sale, an American writer. His book is called Rebels Against the Future, and it's the first considered scholarly academic attempt to evaluate what the Luddites were doing and their role. Rebels Against the Future by Kirkpatrick Sale. We can come back to it afterwards. The British government responded by making it illegal to break machines. And not only illegal, but if you broke machines, you could be sentenced to death for doing it. And Lord Byron, I feel very grateful to Lord Byron, one of the very few public figures of the time. Incidentally, I was in Byron Bay in Australia not long ago. I was found in a very dangerous place. I was bathing in the sea, a big giant wave knocked me over, and I lost my upper denture. And I got it replaced within 24 hours. I thought that was very good going. But a couple of days later, my host took me to the beach again. I took care to remove my dentures, but then after they'd gone, I discovered I'd forgotten to bring my bathing trunks. So I decided to swim in my underpants. And a wave came and knocked me over, and I lost my underpants. Fortunately, a man was waving them about 20 yards away, and I was saying, "They're mine!" And my dignity was restored. But Lord Byron, he said to his fellow peers in the House of Lords in a famous speech where this law was being brought in, he said, "My lords, if you allow this law to be passed and put on the statute book, to implement it, all you will need is 12 butchers for a jury and a hangman for a judge." And he was right. They proceeded to hang these innocent little working people up and down the country for all they were worth. But the Luddite thing was defeat. They were defeated. They lost control of their work. First of all, a new force is emerging in history, the force of money multiplying itself. A new force now comes into being, the force of money allied to technology, which robs people of the power to control their work. Let me put this to you in very personal terms. You see, I was reared in an orphanage in England, hundreds of children without parents. When I was 14, I was sent to work in the bakehouse to learn to make bread. And I look back now and realize I was at the very fag end of a historical process which the Luddites had been fighting about. You see, my old baker, he was near retirement age, but he was a master baker. And he wasn't master baker for nothing. He was a master at his craft. He decided every day how much flour, how much water, yeast, salt to mix in the dough, how long to let it rise, when to light the oven, what to light it with, how much fuel, when to cut the dough back and turn it into loaves, what shape would the loaves be, what size, how long to let the loaves rise, when to put them in the oven, and when to take them out. It was a decision-making, creative role. And at due course, the oven door would be open, and I was privileged to light the gas jet and put it in the oven, huge thing, half the size of this room, with stackelites of soot hanging from the ceiling, a sea of golden loaves shimmering in the oven heat, and a smell like paradise, wafting out to tell the community that for another day its bread had been baked to perfection. And I would hand him the peel. This was a man who would say to me, read me that bit in the paper about Hitler, what's he doing in Germany? And this bloke Franco, what's he up to in Spain? He couldn't read, I could. But he was a master baker. And when I gave him the peel, he would push it under the first loaf near him and bring it towards him, and he would tap the crust. And by God, it had a crust, you know. It wasn't like this supermarket garbage that's clogging your guts and giving you cancer as hard as you can work on it. Put your finger through it, it comes out the other side. It was genuine bread. And there was I at 14, looking up into this old man's face and seeing a look of total satisfaction and accomplishment and fulfillment. His was a decision-making, creative role in one of the ordinary, mundane things of life. And when you look round the modern world, ask yourself, when you think about the problems of young people, what is society offering in terms of decision-making, creative use of their capacities to make decisions, to create, and so on? Ask yourself, when you think of how, well, my bakehouse, my baker retired and they shut the bakehouse down and bread began to be made not by master bakers but by chemists and accountants. And the same is true of all the other things. The clothes we wear today are not made by master tailors, they're made by computers who cut up the cloth according to computerized calculations and so on and so on. And on the farms, you know, I remember in 1945, just after the war, motoring through Austria, and in those days, after the harvest of wheat, the hay was stacked into hay stacks, and each village that I went through had its own haystack, and every haystack was completely different in shape and design. And people who were labouring in the fields with their hands were not content just to pile hay on top of each other and say finish. They designed something that gave pleasure to the eye, something that gave them a sense of pleasure and fulfillment. That world had gone. It was a world which began to go in 1812 when the Luddites were defeated, and it's been taken over now by a compendium of forces of which money and technology are supreme. But, you know, these forces are not only impersonal, they are utterly implacable. They do not stop. They went on to destroy something more valuable to human life than anything else. They went on to destroy human community. Since we're in academic ground, can we define community? A community is a social unit in which the personal relationships of its members are the strongest force determining its character. A community is a social unit in which the personal relationships of the members is the strongest force determining its character. But there are no communities today. In the Western world, they've all been destroyed. And they've been replaced by the most degenerate, the most destructive, the most debilitating, the most dangerous, the most unillumined way of life that has ever surfaced on this planet, the mass form of society, not related to each other, but related instead to different kinds of power structures. And do bear in mind that when you're related to a power structure, your relationship is not a moral one, but a power one. You can only have a moral relationship with your neighbour. This is why Jesus said, love your neighbour. He didn't say love your fellow citizen of the Roman Empire, and he certainly didn't say love Woolworths or any of these giant supermarkets. He said, love your neighbour. And we have destroyed neighbourhood. And Gandhi was right. You can't have morality without community, because morality is based on relationships. And if you don't have those relationships, where is morality and the force of morality? This may explain as much as anywhere why the world today is at 6s and 7s on moral questions. When a year ago I announced that if people took goods from giant supermarkets without paying for them, it was not any moral significance, I created a furore around the world. I think I'm told it even appeared in your newspapers here. I touched the property nerve, and for 5 minutes I was globally famous. And I was doing television interviews with Australia, Canada, America, India, and where? Lined up on my doorstep, photographers, people like this, and telling me this, that, and the other. And my archdeacon rang me Sunday evening to say, Mr. Papworth, you have totally disrupted my weekend. I said, well, archdeacon, you know, when you're labouring in the Lord's vineyard, things can be a little stressful. But, you see, I made these remarks to a police committee in London, but, and still people don't take the point of what I'm saying. They think I was merely talking about a socialistic kind of reallocation of resources. That was not my point at all. What I was saying is that these giant forces, these giant supermarkets, they are using Christian morality and probably the morality of other religious faiths as well to make money, and to make as much money as possible in ways which are destroying the basis of their morality. In England, we have lost nearly 80,000 small shops, many of them in the same family hands for generations. They've been wiped out. They're no longer on the main street. You are 30 or 40 years behind this development, but watch out, it will happen here. In its place, we have got these giant supermarkets, and instead of going round talking to your neighbour, chatting with your neighbour, who may also be the shopkeeper, how are you, Mrs. Brown? How's your husband's rheumatism? Has your son passed his examinations? No, I thought not, and so on and so on. You now go in a car to a remote warehouse, and you've got the fruits of the earth on display for you, and you collect it all in a basket. You give your money to somebody who's underpaid by the hour at the door, who has never seen you before and doesn't give a damn if they ever see you again. And that's the end. That's the end of one of the vital factors of social community life, buying and selling among your neighbours. Okay? And the degree of social impoverishment involved in that revolution is incalculable. What sort of world are your children entering when instead of being able to talk to their neighbours, they've simply got advertising shrieking at them morning, noon and night to buy this, buy that, buy the other. And most of the stuff they're being urged to buy is not only needless, useless, but dangerous. When you kill communities, when you destroy communities, you are destroying the blood cells of civilization. You are destroying the immune system of the body politic. You are making the body politic subject to every conceivable kind of social and moral disease that you can imagine. This is the modern world. This is where we are. And it does seem to me that if anybody has a moral and radical concern to change things and to adopt a responsible citizen role in this context, they ought to be thinking, A, how do we recreate community? B, how do we take control of technology? And C, how do we take control of money? I think actually the money one is quite simple. You know, every local neighbourhood is involved in questions of life and death, of insurance. Perhaps they want pensions. Perhaps they want credit. This, that and the other. There's no earthly reason why they have to go to a big chain bank which is dominating the world. Neighbours among themselves can form a credit cooperative, start accumulating money, decide who to lend it to, start taking dues for pensions, start taking dues for insurance. Not difficult. It's just simply that we've got to change our mind frame and realise that by going on as we are, we're making ourselves victims. The fault, dear Brutus, says Cassius, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. You see, these forces, they never stop. Having destroyed community, they've gone on to destroy the extended family. And then they're now destroying the nuclear family. Increasing numbers of children are growing up under single-parent conditions and being denied their birthright of gender rearing that the male and female could give them. And it's an incredible psychological impoverishment which cannot but spell ill for future developments. Okay, these forces have gone on, they're going on and on and on. And today, they've reached a stage where they now really dominate human life. They have managed to establish an ascendancy where in Europe, they've organized the Europlot, where the plan is that all the different sovereignties of Europe shall disappear in the name of a united federal Europe. In Asia, you're confronted with the same plot in the guise of the multilateral agreement on investment. Please, hands up anybody who has not heard of this MAI. Have we all heard of it?
Only recently.
Everybody. I'm delighted. It was the first meeting I've come to where everybody has. Well, your neck is on the block, just as our neck is on the block in Europe. These boys, the boardroom barons, all they want to do is to abolish whatever democratic powers and controls and safeguards you've managed to salvage through the centuries in order to make a level playing field where they can make more and more money. This is all they're concerned with, making money. If we were a boardroom table here, you might be a pious Muslim, a devout Jew, you might be a pacifist, a member of the Green Party, you might be a Quaker or a Roman Catholic, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter a scrap, because what you're sitting round the boardroom table for is to make money. To make money as much as possible and to do down outside anybody else in your market that threatens your supremacy. Knowing full well if you don't exert yourself like this, they will do it to you. And if you multiply this impersonal, amoral, antisocial thrust thousands of times around the world, this is the dominant thrust of the modern world, reaching an apex today of power. Why do I say that? Am I boring anybody by the way?
No.
You know, I was the speaker at a dinner some time ago, and a man came up to me afterwards, reading away, and said, That was the most boring speech I ever heard in my life. He said, I think the committee was mad to invite you here, and I've half a mind to resign from the association. I thought, well, you can't please all the people all the time, can you? Anyway, the chairman took him away, and when he came back, he said, you know, John, you mustn't take any notice of old Charlie. When he's drunk, he just goes around repeating what he hears everybody else saying. So if anybody's bored, do something a little way. But you see, you can pick up a financial paper any day of the week today. You will hear, read or learn that one giant concern, global dimensions, is merging with another, same straight. Merging, taking over, isn't that bigger? And when they combine, they proceed to join with another supergiant. Then the supergiants proceed to merge. Supergiant. This is the biggest revolution in human history. It is putting into total insignificance all other revolutions that have happened in history. It is happening under our noses, and hardly any of us are aware of either its significance or where it's taking us. And where it's taking us, you can see in the way in which not a single one of your elected politicians, not one, dare speak against the the MAI, or the Europlot, or the North American Trade Agreement. You have elected these people to represent you and your interests in government. But listen to what they say. They dare not. They know why. Because so great is the power of these forces today. They're swilling sums of money around on the internet and the rest of it, which are bigger than many countries' budgets. They're controlling the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. They're in a position to target any government they don't like and destabilize it, with monkeying about with interest rates, with creating a panic rush on its currency, jiggering around with stock market shares and so on and so on. And the political boys know it. They know that if any one of them stands up, these forces will use the media to demolish them politically. There are not many of us that haven't got some sexual or social or financial or some other scandal in our lives we wouldn't prefer, however big or however small, to keep under the wraps. These people, they will dig it out and blow it up, and that'll be that. And if they can't find anything in your background, they'll invent it. It reminds me when the Archbishop of Canterbury went to New York, and at his press conference they got rather bored with him and him with them, and finally one of them said, well, Arch, you going to any nightclubs while you're here? And the Archbishop looked down his nose and said, are there any nightclubs in New York? And the next day the tabloids all had banner headlines. Archbishop's first question, are there any nightclubs? Can't win. Can't win. You see, what has happened is that you academics who ought to be teaching sensible politics are teaching rubbish. Same with economics. You are teaching in economics that the factors of production are land, labour and capital. This is the most evil and most insulting statement you could make. You're saying that human beings made in the image of God are of no more account than a cabbage patch or a bag of money. And you're using that formula to build a structure of economic theory, marginal analysis and all the rest of it, then super theory. And the basis of it is rotten. That's why economist people today have got no answers to the global crisis. They're looking in the wrong direction on a false basis. Human beings are not a factor of production, they are the object of it. And if they're not the object of production, what the hell is the purpose of production at all? Okay? You are teaching in politics that if you get the vote, then all will be well, that we're living in a nice, bright democracy. You're completely ignoring that as the power of the ballot box has risen, other powers have risen even faster and more powerful in greater extent. Power of money, power of the media, power of the military, administration on centralized lines. We go on and on. What they've done is to push the significance of the ballot box to the sidelines. And there are theoretical reasons for that. As any unit of politics grows, the significance of the individual declines. As any unit grows in size, the significance of the individual declines. If we are a boardroom, we are perhaps a dozen or so people. We can each claim to have 1/12 of whatever we are deciding. What is more, as a boardroom, we have a moral relationship with each other because we know each other. There is that factor in our deliberations. If we are citizens of China, 1,000 million people, we are 1,000 million of the power to run China, which means nothing whatsoever. But notice something. As the unit gets bigger and the individual significance gets smaller, the power gets larger. And if the individual becomes insignificant as the power gets bigger, then who is controlling the power? Can't be the individual. It's at the center. It's at the center where all the power exists, all the capacity to control, to manipulate, and all the rest of it, make decisions. And we have to learn that democracy, like anything else, is a value statement. It's a moral statement. And morality is something that pertains to human relationships, not to institutions. By all means, let's have big institutions where we need them. You know, people sometimes talk about world government. You know Tennyson in Locksley Hall? Far along the world-wide whisper of the south wind rushing warm, the banners of the people plunging through the thunderstorm, till the war drums beat no longer and the battle flags were furled in the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the World. Good, high-sounding stuff, but terribly, terribly dangerous. Government exists to do things that we can't do for ourselves. Never forget it. Never forget that democracy doesn't mean government of the people, nor does it mean government for the people. These are totalitarian concepts. It means government by the people. And government by the people, since it's a moral statement, can only be done initially, basically, on a small scale, where people are related to each other in communities. And if I were to start talking about communities again, I'd simply be repeating myself. Let's look for a moment, if I'm not boring you, at the history of the 20th century itself. You see, that century began with a war, which was a world war. Nobody, in my experience, in all my reading, has ever explained to me why that war occurred at all. Nobody. Why did it occur? What was its object? What were they trying to achieve? What happened was that the nations of Europe had been created by people like Bismarck, Napoleon, Garibaldi, Richelieu in France, the Tudor monarchs in England, from city-states into giant nations. These city-states, before the age of technology, had reached an apex of glory in almost every field of human creativity. Whether you're looking at art or architecture or painting or sculpture or poetry or theatre or music, you're looking at something totally supreme in human experience. And you would have thought that on that basis we would have gone on to reach ever higher spheres of glory and accomplishment. What happened instead is the Bismarcks and the Napoleons and Richelieu stepped in and created out of these city-states no more than 250,000 people, giant nations. those giant nations were out of control. That's why the war took place in 1914. It pulled the plug out of Western civilization, and it's never been able to recover from it. And it never will until it realizes that if we want to achieve anything sensible, purposeful in human life, first of all, we've got to control the factors that enable us to achieve it. And if we can't control it, we're wasting our time. Just think, though, that nations which had reached that apex of glory in 1914 started training and arming and equipping young men by the million to fight and kill and maim one another for years on end. And you know, and the first year of that war, on Christmas Day, the British troops and the German troops got out of their trenches. They didn't want to fight. And they had a game of football. They thought Christmas Day was the birthday of the Prince of Peace. So why not celebrate the birthday of the Prince of Peace with a nice game of football? And they did. And the High Command on both sides said, oh, you must stop that. That's fraternizing with the enemy. You'll spoil our war. My wife was French. She lived in Flanders, her family. You can't walk a quarter of a mile from her village without coming to cemeteries in any direction, with rows after rows after rows of white crosses of young men who died in that catastrophic war. Because that war, it not only killed men, it killed some vital spiritual elements of human life, which is why it went on to breed the horrors of Hitler and Stalin, the atomic bomb. Think of that, dropping on a Japanese city, one bomb, wiping out its entire inhabitants in a matter of seconds. We don't have within ourselves, we don't have the moral capacity to respond, to measure the monstrosity of what was accomplished. And it's led to the modern world we're living in today, where every kind of culture, because those nations were out of control, they couldn't stop themselves fighting and going to war anymore. They could stop themselves embarking on the colonial exercises around the world, in Asia, in Africa and elsewhere. And they end up with a situation where today we're facing a situation where we're approaching a world, we're approaching another century, and you would have thought that inheritors as we are of one of the mightiest revolutions of productive capacity in all history, it would be opening the gates to a world of peace, progress, plenty, and all the rest of it. But we're not entering that world. We're entering a world that's going to be marked by shortages of basic things, of oil, of land, of water, and food. It's happening because the population explosion is out of control. And no government can do anything about population numbers in democratic terms, because it's governments that have caused the problem. You see, if you take away from people their sense of responsibility for all the factors of their lives, whether it's police or education or hospitals or transport or anything to do with their local lives that they can fully do themselves, why should they have any sense of responsibility about human numbers? When I was a boy, the world population was 1-point-something billion. Today, China has a bigger population than that, and the world population is rising 6 billion. And the experts, I know the experts are people who make bigger mistakes, but the experts are telling us that in a matter of decades it's going to be 12 billion. Well, the globe won't stand it. You know, the planet is afflicted with the disease, and that disease is humanity. We are ignoring all the warning signs. We continue to drive our cars knowing that the ozone layer is being depleted, that global warming is increasing. We know that the food we're eating is poisonous. it's being saturated with poisons from one part of the productive process to the other. Something about pesticides plus fungicide plus herbicide plus insecticide equals homicide. That's my equation. But you see, the Sumeranians, they had the biggest irrigation project in all history. That country is now Iraq, and the cities that once flourished there are now buried in sand. The Roman and the Greek civilizations insisted on doing the same thing, using slave labor and monoculture, the same crop year after year, except that in both Greece and Italy, the slopes are rather steep. The soil got loose, was washed into the sea, the civilizations crashed, and now those countries can only produce grapes and olives, perhaps peanuts, raw. United States, I was in the Corn Belt about 3 years ago. The water is yellow with the soil that's being washed from the Corn Belt into the Mississippi and the Colorado, and the spectacle of US farming is more frightening than anything that could be imagined if you know the facts of the case. The potential for global starvation on that sort of basis, and what the Americans alone are doing, is just too terrible to contemplate. You know, an American said to me in New Zealand not long ago, you know, John, the way we're going on with this planet, I reckon we've been sent here from some other planet as a quarantine station for the criminally insane. The black soil areas of Russia are being written off by the thousands of acres every year. I got this from an American intelligence source. Because under communism, they used these chemicals which disintegrated the soil structure, loosened it, subjected it to wind blow. When the rains came, it also got washed away. We could go on and on like this. You know, we owe something to ourselves, to our own sense of dignity about who we are and what we are. And we owe something to our children. And we've got really to start asserting a new path for humankind, if humankind is to see daylight. I come from a religious belief which talks about there being two cardinal laws. One is to love God and love your neighbour. I don't know how anybody can love God if you're trampling on the earth and desecrating it in every conceivable way as hard as you can go. That's not loving God, that's hating Him. And our modern, everyday lifestyle is doing just that, with our motor cars, our refrigerated air, our lights in sunlight, the way we're building, and so on and so on. Sometime there's got to be a stop. People have got to stop in their tracks and say, look, have we gone far enough? And should we start turning things round? And don't think when you start asking that question, you're alone. I've been privileged in the last 5 months to be traveling through America, Australia, New Zealand, and here. And everywhere I've met people who are concerned, people who are worried, people who are anxious to see what can be done, and who in fact are doing things to promote change in different ways. Change which makes sense of the human situation. In London, there are groups of people now sitting down in the streets to stop the traffic and saying we want to claim the streets back for human beings. That's what they were there for in the first place, not for machines. So get off the cars and get on the bus. There's a scheme which has swept, in minority terms, don't let me overplay it, but swept through Canada, the United States, Europe, and Australia and New Zealand. Here and there, a new thing called LETS, Local Exchange Trading Scheme, where people are linked together in a small community, and you will dig your neighbour's garden, and she will clean your windows or babysit for you, and there will be a credit and a debit account kept for all these different little exchange of services, where instead of every house having its own complement of carpet sweepers and all the rest of it, people borrowed these machines, lent them to each other on the same debit and credit thing. And in doing so, bypassing the money system altogether, getting the tax people very worried, and so on. There's not a city in Europe and in many other countries, certainly America today, where you won't find health food shops, where food is being sold, which has got integrity and won't poison you when you eat it. And you can't say that for anything in modern supermarkets. A policeman told me the other day that when he was young, started off, the main concern during a murder or a fatal accident was to move the body before decomposition set in. He said today they don't worry so much because decomposition is so much slower because of all the preservatives in our food, which we are just, it's significant. You see, people are no longer sort of eating with the idea of wholesomeness for the kind of body they're passing on through their genes to future generations. They're just living for the day. And all this advertising is encouraging them. There are movements now to take control of television. Just think of the godlike quality and power of television to elevate, to inspire, to inform, to educate, to widen the imagination, to make people aware of the incredible cultural riches of the human story down the ages in every part of the world. And we're putting that power in the hands of people who only want to make money out of it. And what happens as a consequence? In order to make as much money, they start pandering to the lowest possible levels of taste, knowing that's where the money is, where people would turn on. Somehow or other, we've got to start having elected responsible boards. Perhaps the academic world will start with responsible boards to control television in the interest of people, in the interest of the survival of our civilization. I'm finished. I could go on all day, but I suspect you've had enough. I only just want to end this. You know, in Julius Caesar, there's a big argument about military strategy, and Brutus cuts it short by saying to Cassius, before the Battle of Philippi, there is a tide in the affairs of men, which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries, and on such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current as it serves, or lose our ventures. And Cassius replies, then, with your will, go on. And this is the only message I can bring with all the force I can muster to you. With your will, go on. We haven't got an awful lot of time. Thank you for your patience in listening to me.
So, as usual, if you have any comments, questions, queries, etc., etc.
Sorry, what did you say?
No, I was just asking the floor whether they would like to, latch on to what you've been saying.
Come on, bellyache away.
I have a comment to make. I don't think one could dispute what you say, basically. But in the final analysis, which
is there such a thing?
Oh, well, manner of speaking. Let me rephrase it. If you would like to reconstruct what you've been saying, one would then say basically that humankind faces a crisis of spiritual identity, basically. It's a spiritual problem within us. We begin with the individual and we end with the individual at any one point in our history. If that is the case, and I believe it is, where would you think that organized religion has failed us in this process? That was one of its primary functions anyway. You know, if I look at the church today, or I look at the way Islam is handled to a large extent, also Buddhism, or Hinduism, it becomes a kind of mafia for me.
A kind of what?
A mafia. It's a kind of a sanctified mafia, and I begin to wonder where did it, if at all, stray from its original purpose or
Well, I can only
duty.
speak for my own background. I get the impression that the clergy of my Anglican church are probably the biggest single organized force for the obstructing the spread of Christianity that there is. I think collectively they have a spinal problem, but there's also an imaginative problem. You know, my archdeacon said to me that supermarkets were good things. They create jobs and the prices are lower. You see, it indicates that even in elevated religious circles, people's minds are saturated with the values of consumerism and the consumerist world as created by advertising, the money market and so on. But when you ask how the churches have failed, I think that, you know, I put it in very crude terms and say Jesus kicked the establishment up the bum, he didn't lick it. I think that there's this difficulty that in any structure, any hierarchy, it's also a power element. And inevitably, since it's on a mass basis, then the centralized control is concerned not so much with its basic objectives, it's concerned first and foremost with its own position, its own internal promotion prospects, its security, its capacity to continue in the office that it's got and not to be shifted from it, and so on. And these things, they're not just true of any religion, they're true of any organization, on a mass basis. This is why it's true of charities and political parties. I think of political parties especially. In fact, I was a parliamentary candidate for the Labour Party in England in the 1955 election. And it was a turning point in my life because I suddenly realized that it was not, I saw firsthand that it was not the members of the Labour Party who were controlling the Labour Party machine. It was the party machine that was controlling the members. Everybody would sit round the table waiting expectantly for the regional secretary to come in and lay down the law about what was what. And the idea that the position should be reversed, that the secretary should be in trembling and fear of what the members would be saying, was just too remote. Well, I was offered a safe seat in Parliament and turned it down because I could see that it would be a totally false position for me. And I've spent the rest of my adult life trying to locate why mass politics doesn't work, why a mass democracy is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in words. And I've written books about it. One is called New Politics, another is called Small is Powerful. I edit a magazine called Fourth World Review, and I'll give you a sheet of paper about it. If you've got any money, put on that to pay for it. I won't object. And my next book is called Why the London School of Economics Should Be Shut Down. And I've written a small booklet called Shut Up and Listen, which is a collection of the aphorisms I've accumulated over a period. But, you know, this sort of activity is going on up and down the world. It's one of the most encouraging things around. But when you ask what the cause of the religious failure is, it's simply in that since all religious structures are inevitably part of the general structure of society, they dare not knock that structure without harming their own structural interests, regardless of the moral implications of what is at stake. And I think this is why well, when I go back to England, you see they've stopped me preaching and functioning as a priest. They can't stop me being a priest, because, you know, this is something much more important, but they've stopped me functioning. So when I go back, I'm going to start a new church called the Gutter Church. And when you're in the gutter, you're able to see the stars, aren't you? But I'm going to preach and pray for all the things in the gutter that they don't preach and pray about inside the church. And I think The church, in fact, is one of the very few spheres today, I mean churches, religion generally, where the democratic idea has failed to take hold and penetrate. This is probably the main reason.
Let me ask you a question about praxis, for want of a better word. If your analysis of our current crisis is one that inheres, let's say, in a sort of a mad race to create more and more and more accumulation, where would one find a solution to the problem? I'm interested in sort of how do we get around this problem? I mean, you did say a bit vaguely, I thought, that intellectuals or academics might be the logical place to begin a sort of a critique of the current madness.
Well,
but
you're asking the question.
I'm wondering if that is actually the right location.
You're asking
Change.
the question as an academic with the validity of the assumptions they're working on. First and foremost, because this is what you're doing full time. You're carrying on, as it were, the intellectual burden of society. And if you're not questioning the validity of your assumptions, and making and clarifying in your own heads where we are and where we ought to be going, you're not doing your job. It does seem to me that one of the biggest needs at the moment is, you see, the student world generally, I've never known it in all my life to be so passive, and it's passive because it's bewildered. It's seen that communism and all these other 19th century isms have been exploded. It's aware that, you know, we're not going to solve the problems of the 21st century with the anarchisms of the 19th, but it doesn't know where to go. And university people generally ought to be at least raising a signpost. And it does seem to me that nothing at the moment is more urgent than the need for conferences to discuss how to make democracy effective. I mean, in terms of putting decision-making power in people's hands.
But I would dispute you, John, and say that there are no noises made in these environments, in these communities. I mean, there's all the time all kinds of critiques and protests, you know, in conferences and seminars. But what I'm saying is, none of these things, you know, have cut much ice in recent years. I mean, the same kind of thing that you are doing, working with Consumer International, or those of us who work with some small NGOs in some other places and so on. None of these efforts, I believe, have been able to compete with, for want of a better word, with the behemoth that you depicted. So I'm still stuck on this problem of praxis. Where do you go from here?
Well, again, I don't think you're questioning your own assumptions enough. And this is why, when you come up with answers, they fall into a pattern which people have heard before and they're not interested. Let me put it this way. One of the projects I'm working on now is for the 14th Assembly of the Fourth World. We've had these assemblies before, but this time I want to do it in a different way. I want to get a letter to every non-governmental organization that's seeking to improve things and to change things, and say to them, look, please send us a paper explaining what you're trying to do, how you're trying to do it, and what you hope to achieve. And we'll use this paper as the basis for one of the workshops in the Assembly, so that we'll have workshops on politics, on economics, on land and taxation, anything you like, health and environment and so on and so on. When these workshops get together, I want to see them doing three things: to see how they can improve what they're already doing. Secondly, to see how their efforts can be linked to those of other people working in contiguous fields. But thirdly, to take on board a draft general statement about the global crisis. What is the global crisis? How can we tackle it? And what should we be doing? A sort of general statement, a bit like, you know, in terms of the Communist Manifesto of 1848 under Marx. A document which is just putting down as clearly as possible what the factors of the global crisis are and what people ought to be doing to respond to it. And using that document afterwards, when it's been passed by the final assembly, as the basis for an educational revolution, if you like, around the world. Well, what do you think of that? Because, you see, these things don't exist at the moment. This is why the students have got nothing to bite onto. And I don't think there's a single economics lecturer talking about human-scale economics and repudiating orthodox economic teaching. There's not a single professor of politics, it seems to me.
No, I think that's too sweeping. I think there are people who are working in the academic world on some of these questions.
Well, why haven't they had the sack yet?
I think you paint a too bleak well, I'm not necessarily an optimist either, but I think there are pockets of people in universities and elsewhere who do things. But again, they're always the counter-hegemony, not the they're always the not the hegemonic forces at all. I mean, by definition, they're not the hegemonic forces because they're opposing the mainstream. So it's, I'm still actually stuck on this question of how we sort of bring about change in a meaningful way. If we accept the thesis in the first place, that what you're saying is unassailable. I'm not sure about that too, but for the moment I can't think of what I'm not sure about in terms of your thesis. It's very persuasive, but
I'd like to hear from one of the ladies present because they haven't spoken.
You're talking about the changes that brought about by globalization. Changes, say Malaysia, for example. People, the lower income people say, okay, now we can get jobs. Now, from doing nothing in the village, now we have some jobs in the factories. We can buy new clothing. We have more time. Never mind about working at night for the ladies. Never mind about breaking up families. At least they are free now to earn an income. So, because I ask people around, say for example, the Malays in Malaysia, most of the girls are in the factories now. And then this globalization process has caused family disruption, has caused mothers to work in factories, has caused mothers not at home at night, have caused incest, rapes, have caused young people going for drugs, and about 100,000 in the Pusat Serenti, this drug center. So, what are you going to do? Okay, what are you going to do? So you talk to one side. Okay, the religious group will say, these are the reason for not following the religious teaching of Islam. You go to the mainstream political parties. They said, this is sacrifice for changes. We want to modernize our country. Even our Prime Minister also say, better people, we want to industrialize. So half of the workforce must work in the factory. When I asked him the question of young people do not want to study higher, they are satisfied with factory works. So, and the media playing a bigger role, as you say. So how do we go about organizing people? Then they will say, whose value, what change you want some more? We want to modernize. We follow the American style. But the point is, you come to think, change for what? Change for better, change for modern living?
I think you're asking absolutely the right question, but what comes to me, you see, is that a lot of the things that are in people's head belong to the 19th century. The idea that we want progress, that we want more, bigger, more of everything. When you think about it, look, I've just finished reading a book by an Australian civil engineer who's been examining in great detail the oil situation. He reckons that taking into account all the alternatives and all the substitutes and all the rest of it, that by 2020 oil production will have peaked in the Arab world where there's most of it, but that it will become exhausted in many other areas long before then. And what he's indicating is that, for example, the aviation industry has only got about another 15 years. It's something which has shot up in human history, and it's going to shoot down, because whatever they discover in the way of keeping motor cars on the road, and even that is still highly questionable, they're never going to get those giant aeroplanes in the air without oil. There's no substitute for that. You have to see it in terms, you think of a flat line of the finite reserves of oil in the globe. And there have been no new oil discoveries of any significance for 2 decades. You have to see this against not only the soaring population figures of the world, but you have to see it against what you're just talking about, the soaring expectations. Something like 85%, I'm told, of Chinese families now have access to television. Well, I suppose Chinese people like Indians, Brazil, and Indonesians and elsewhere are not going to see these ghastly Hollywood films without wanting something of the Hollywood lifestyle, unless somebody comes along and tries to tell them something better. I think that it is possible to do this. You see, we may not control the mass media. We may not have much influence in getting our voices heard inside the mass media. But this is one sphere where ordinary people are taking action quite dramatically. I have a bin next to my desk in London, big back builder's bin, called my magazine file, and every month it's full up with these small magazines that are being produced by different groups or different people around the world. And if you take collectively the readerships of these small magazines, they constitute themselves a market which compares in size with the mass readerships. But the difference, of course, is whereas the mass is the mass, these small ones are an organically structured approach. Each magazine is just done by a few people with a limited circulation. And I think this is how the change will take place. I've never one for sudden giant revolutions. You know, they say when the pot boils, it's the scum that rises to the top. And it's certainly true of all the revolutions we've seen so far. But you know, things aren't what they seem. Reminds me of when the Pope went to Ireland and they gave him this huge Rolls Royce to ride around in. And when he saw it, he said to the driver, look, I've always wanted to drive one of these, why don't you hop in the back? And they hadn't gone very far before he was had up for speeding. And the policeman said to him, well, looked at the papers and said, are you the Pope? Well, I'm terribly sorry, sir, do please go. And he got on the blower to his colleagues and said, for goodness sake, clear the road as hard as you can. There's a very, very important man coming. He's much more important than our president or our prime minister. So this chap said, well, who is this man? He said, well, I don't know, but he's being driven by the Pope. Things aren't what they seem, but there is an awful lot going on. You mentioned people in universities, but it's something echoed right through the thing. What is needed is a kind of cohesion of these voices, these ideas, but also a fresh basis on which they're based, which sort of, you know, puts the 19th century and Karl Marx and Labour parties and mass parties generally behind us.
Well, I think all that you said, there's nothing disagreeable with all that you said, and I'm sure a lot of people will agree with some of your, with all of your description of what's happening in society today, including, I think, people who live in the third world, who don't sort of have access to the kind of mass consumer culture that you are talking about. But what I'm trying to say here is that, ironically, what you just said may not be enough to convince people to change their lifestyle, to change society around them. Because what is happening here is that people will tend to revert to options that can organize their life efficiently. For example, you have a giant supermarket and a small grocery store. But the giant supermarket happens to sell goods that are much cheaper than the small grocery store. So if you go by the rational principles of efficiency and people want to maximize their gains, so logically, you see, they'll go to the giant supermarket. And I think that in a situation like this, it will take extremely great moral conviction, for example, to undertake the alternative, the other option of, say, going back to the small, beautiful kind of philosophy. It takes a extremely strong moral conviction, for example, to walk to work in a place like this rather than use private cars. So well, basically what I'm trying to say is that while people generally around the world are quite cognizant of the kind of evilness that you're talking about, the madness of the situation, the kind of limited choices that they have. But I think it takes an alternative which is as big or as strong as the present hegemony that we have today to be able to convince people to give up what they have now.
I'm sorry I missed something. You said
well, I think there has to be
strong.
an alternative that is as strong as the establishment structure that we have today. I think it's not enough for small groups around the world to have alternative philosophies, because, as I say, at the end of the day, lives have to be organized efficiently. Well, at least that's in the ideologies of the common person, including ourselves, I think. The system that they operate is still the most efficient, and for a lot of people, the most affordable. Well, I know that in the north, for you to be able to consume goods that are produced by the third world, for example, I mean, people buy coffee, people buy crafts that are produced in the third world, but these goods happen to be more expensive than the ones that are produced in the factories, in the machines, in a mass way. So there's an irony and a contradiction there, and it's not easy for people to make a choice. Because if you think that you're supporting the coffee growers in Guatemala, it would mean that you would have to spend more buying coffee produced by Guatemala, small coffee growers, versus buying coffee produced by Brazilian, somewhere else that's commercially produced. Or Nestle, the coffee is much cheaper.
If you didn't run a car, you might be able to afford to. It's
I'm saying that yes, we all agree with you. There's no quarrel about that. See that position.
No, what you're really doing is hitting some of the difficulties confronting us, and you're quite right to do so. But I think it doesn't mean because things are difficult that thereby we are invalidating our own case. After all, you say it's not enough for all these little groups around the world. Of course it's not. But a generation ago they didn't exist at all. And it's an organic change that I see going on, step by step. You don't see a tree suddenly burst into leaf, but during the course of a year, those leaves will emerge, and I think something like that. There is, I think, going on right now, a profound sea change of human consciousness, that people who think at all are beginning to see that you know, we've got to change quite drastically and quite quickly in different ways if we're not to land in even much greater trouble than we are at the moment. And we come back always to what was being said earlier, that, you know, the trouble is that people don't see a way out. And this is where it seems to me those who are in a position to give a moral or intellectual lead ought to be helping to do it. And I think there's far too much readiness to sort of rest assumptions on 19th century ideas. And since, you know, the dangerously exploitative policies of Western governments, especially the United States and Europe, have produced such marvellous results. Therefore, you know, if the rest of the world is not getting the same results, that's not just. But what's not just is that the Americans and the Europeans are doing this at all, because they are despoiling the world and making it impossible for a general level of prosperity to emerge. But, you know, you have to take it on board too that I came here through San Francisco. Now, San Francisco is one of the richest cities in one of the richest countries in the world. I saw more street beggars in San Francisco than I've seen anywhere else outside India. And the lesson you learn, so we come back to your point about the individual. You see, it's not always just the individual. The lesson I derive from this is that the bigger the unit, the bigger the polarization of wealth and poverty. This is why India is stuck in a groove and can't get out of it. The millions of impoverished Indian people of that subcontinent are never going to be other than impoverished, because the whole unit is so large it's impossible to get an even spread. India, in fact, isn't a country, it's a colonial empire. The headquarters was shifted from London to Delhi 50 years ago, and the colonial empire is still sitting on the necks of the Nagas and the Khalistanis and the Tamils and the Kashmiris and all the other independent little peoples. It's worth bearing in mind there's something like 31 wars going on around the world at the moment for small nations trying to get out of the grip of big ones. And reflect too on the general trend since World War I, that where people have had a voice, the Czechs and the Slovaks have decided to have separate countries. The Yugoslavians have gone through that dreadful business, but with the same purpose. The former United Federal Russian Communist Empire, whatever it called itself, it is now 16 different republics, and will be more before we go on. Pakistan broke away from India. Bangladesh broke away from Pakistan. You could go on around the world. This drift towards the small is corresponding to certain basic realities. If you think, if you look at the global league table, what you see in terms of the wealthiest at the top, the poorest at the bottom, is that China and India are at the bottom. But the top 30 nations in the world league table, 20 of them have populations of less than 10 million. And you know, at one time, Scandinavia was one giant, part of a giant Swedish empire. It's now Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. And these are 4 of the most prosperous countries in the world. I wonder if you realize that the richest country in the world in terms of GDP per capita, gross domestic product per capita, is Iceland. And it's got only, I think, a couple of million people. And Iceland, of course, is wealthy because it has these abundance of hot mineral springs, which provide with nearly all its heating and hot water all over the place. But seriously, you have to look at these small countries if you want to see improvements in social life. They've taken the lead in abolishing capital punishment. They've taken the lead in abolishing corporal punishment in the army and in schools. They've taken the lead in women's rights. They've taken the lead in giving liberation and recognition and toleration to homosexuals and lesbians and so on. And it's the big countries where you find intolerance and aggression and the spirit of force operating all the time. All the three giants, America, India and China, have capital punishment. They're all thermonuclear powers. They've all been involved in wars, unending. You take China, with all its poverty, 1,000 million people, they'd be sitting around wondering how to get rid of some people so they could manage better. Instead, they go and invade Tibet and try to destroy its culture, and then proceed to make world war noises about claiming to rule Taiwan, which is 200 miles from the shores. And India, since independence, so-called, the home of saintly Gandhi and non-violence and pacifism and all the rest of it, has had a military confrontation with every one of its neighbours. America has been involved in every major war in this century, still trying to start a third world war in the Middle East. You could go on and on. Oh, well, it's rash, fierce blaze of riot, cannot last. But when you ask these questions about poor people and how you can effect justice, we have to see that however alluring the consumption levels of the Western world are, they're quite unsustainable. That another 50 years will see the millions of people in London and New York either drifting out to grow their own food or they'll starve. There's no city in history that survived that doesn't grow its food. And but I think all sorts of other things are coming to the boil, which it's not going to wait for the oil to run out. I think that the social factors and more pressures are boiling up, which are going to make life intolerable on the basis of present conditions. Sorry, talking too much.
Let me try to ask you a question, Mr. Papworth. This question is about organizing, arguing that becoming bigger is disastrous in many instances. We have big buildings, we have political powers which are too big, and we have big nations which are poor. But on the other hand, this movement that you are describing, these small movements about changing our society, what do you think, Mr. Papworth? Is this not going to be a big movement too, in the end? If it will be, if it is going to have impact, which is actually the question of Professor Zaranutu and Dr. Masna. It must be a big movement in order to have impact.
Not just its village, and not some vast area of an urban city which is too big, but every little local neighbourhood, every year elects a neighbourhood council. And that council, because it's elected by the people in that neighbourhood, is the basic source of authority for all other things that happen throughout the world. And if you imagine a neighbourhood community with command of its own resources, think of it in terms of a village where it decides on the bank, it decides on the policeman, it decides on who is allowed to come in to trade and who isn't, so that you don't get this ubiquitous phenomena of giant sort of food garbage stores with a Scottish name, sort of setting up their sign everywhere, where local people are controlling what goes on. Well, in the nature of things, if local people are electing local neighbourhood council, then it'll stay a local one, won't it?
This model of local election were practiced in this country based on the traditional system.
So practice when?
The traditional political system in this country, they practice this electing their own chief, you know, but colonization destroy all this political structure. So are you suggesting we back to the people's power? But of course the modern political the holders will not allow it.
You're saying that's your traditional rule.
Yes.
It's interesting. But that's the same true in Russia. I mean, even under Tsarist despotisms, the Russian villages elected the mayor, the local Russian village council. But when you say that it was traditional, I get the impression that the same is true of many other countries. It's certainly true of Africa. And I think it leads me to suggest that wherever, let me put it another way, when I was a young man, I joined a movement called the Movement for Colonial Freedom. And when all these countries became independent, which had been colonies, we decided that the movement had accomplished its work and could sort of break up and dissolve. But the more I look at the modern world, the more I see that colonialism is still rampant, in that nearly all forms of government that are practiced in Asia are forms which have inherited from 19th century colonial ideas. They're not native to the territories themselves at all. And the same is certainly true of Africa. Just think what happened in Africa where, you know, the Egyptian pharaohs, going back thousands of years, when they sent emissaries into Africa, they were parleying with African tribal chiefs. The African tribal system is probably one of the oldest and most stable systems of government in the world. And you have to see what a triumph it was when you look at the sheer size of Africa. You can get England into the Sahara Desert 60 times. In Zambia, where I was personal assistant to the president for about 9 years, it was 5 times larger than England. And the tragedy was that Africa had never had a beast of burden. The zebra and the elephant in Africa are untamable, and they've not known the horse until modern times because of its susceptibility to tsetse fly. The camel is only in the north. They've never had a navigable river to the coast through those thousands of miles. So it means that any form of economic development that took place in the centre couldn't be reflected in trade to the coast without being carried on human backs. And when it got to the coast, those enormously lengthy coastlines, there are only about 3 natural harbours. And even so what? You're confronted with thousands of miles of open sea. And if you contrast that with England in the 14th century, was clothing half the armies of Europe with its wool, and the short distances involved, the facilities of navigation and the horse and so on, you can see why development was so different. What it means, though, is that you see the colonial powers came into Africa, and within just 100 years, they redrew the map of Africa, they drew it, simply ignoring all the tribal realities of the continent. And the upshot is they've left behind these fragile, eggshell sort of nation states which have no basis in African history or tradition, and which are riddled with corruption and, you know, just running into the ground. There's no way that any of these governments is ever going to repay the debts it's incurred for development, and there's no way it can develop in these terms either. So when you look at maps anywhere around the world and you see straight lines, the first thing you can say is that's a colonial map. It's not a people's map. And what is needed is to draw a world map of people's lines, bioregions, natural boundaries like mountain ranges or river courses and so on, watersheds and so on. Until we get round to that, this will mean that we will be reflecting then again the wisdom of our ancestors, the people who came before us. We can take up where they left off and start again.
But the wisdom of the ancestors had been wiped out of the mind of the young of today.
It'll come back.
Yeah. Very,
Everybody happy?
yeah,
Want to go on?
very interesting.
Yes. Is there anywhere that you can get some coffee here which is not Nescafe or not tasting like the bottom of a duck pond? No?
Black
We
coffee.
will try.
It's only black
We are
coffee.
going somewhere. We will try and cater here.
Well, it's been a great pleasure being with you folks, and
Thank you.
I hope I have not bored you.
No, no,
Most
no.
people tend to
Very-
bore the toenails off a tortoise, don't they? And
Yeah, nice to meet
But there is
people
a-
like you who are very concerned.
there is a leaflet here you
Oh.
might like to have a
Yeah.
copy of. Care to pass it along?
Councils breed local bullies. Multinational enterprises breed bullies on a multinational scale. I think the answer to the real crisis is something that Latif tried to touch on. And
Sorry,
that
is what?
is what Latif tried to touch on, and
Try
the-
to
which he tried to introduce. And that is, in order for this crisis, which you have highlighted quite nicely, to become under control or to be under control or to come under control, the change must begin with the self, with the person. Because your local council breeds local bullies simply because people who get voted are voted on the basis of misinformation. I mean, you can have a local council getting a guy who's there who's totally unpopular simply because he's manipulated the system. Now, until and unless the change begins with the self, the individual, I see no real answer to this world crisis.
If you don't mind my saying so, I'm going to be very blunt with you. I think you're indulging in a middle-class cop-out. You see, I was on a train in 1945, a troop train going through the Ruhr. This was at the very last stage of the war. And when the train was going through mounds of rubble, which had what had formerly been German industrial cities, and it was crawling at a pace because the track was not safe, and another troop train came in the opposite direction. The troop train coming the opposite way was a German one, and turned out to be a hospital troop train, and it was full of wounded German soldiers on stretchers and on crutches, and they were obviously starving. And those two trains stopped next to each other. You didn't need any great religious revival movement. You didn't need any archbishops to start praying. You didn't need anybody to talk about the need for moral uplift. Without any hesitation, those British soldiers who were well fed were digging into their knapsacks and pulling out cigarettes and chocolates and oranges and anything they could give to those German troops on that train. You know, what you have to face is that modern life is traumatizing human decency and making it something impossible to cope with, because there is no margin of responsibility that people can respond to, and so on. But my argument is this: that human beings everywhere, whether you're in Malaya or Europe or America or anywhere, they are decent. And their nature provides an abundance of leadership in any community to ensure that by and large things will move in a decent direction. This doesn't mean there won't be exceptions. There are no straight lines in nature, and there's certainly none in human nature. But the idea that, you know, we've got to wait for some kind of religious revival in people to say, oh, I'm not bad, I'm good, before the world can change, I think it's poppycock. I think that what we've got to do is liberate human beings from the massively evil forces which are disintegrating their psychic personalities. Just think what is involved when you motor along a road, never mind being in a car, and you're confronted everywhere with hoarding, say, buy this, buy that, buy the other, and so on. Think of the psychic stress that's being imposed on you. You may even not be aware of it. But, and then think what's happening when people are looking at television. All their all their propensities for greed, for self-gratification, everything are being pandered to. And you know, I don't want to go on, but I think this gives us the clue as to what happened when Princess Diana died, when she was killed. You see, at one avenue, people are getting a message from the advertising world to say you're nothing but a lot of pack of ignorant consumerist slobs. We're making money out of you as fast as we can, and we'll make you engage in indulge in your propensities and your appetites to the utmost degree so we can make more and more money. And people know that this message coming out of advertising is one of contempt for them. They know it. And then along comes this radiant royal figure, young, beautiful, rich. One day she's cradling an African starving child. Next day she's hugging somebody with AIDS, and the next day she's helping a wounded mines victim along. All the highly emotive charities. She was manipulating the media for all she was worth. She was a bit of a slag, dear old thing, but nevertheless, she created an image of decency in people's minds around the world. And I met a woman in London shortly after she was killed. A woman had flown in from Canada just to put a wreath outside Buckingham Palace and fly back to Canada the same day. But the churches were full of the services for her. And I think people had somehow seen her as a sort of icon, an image of decency and goodness and purity and all the rest of it. She may have been none of these things. That didn't matter. That's what they saw. And they reacted. And I think that's, you know, I think it tells you something enormous about people. So forgive me if I sound rather vigorous in rejecting what you're saying.
I agree completely with what you said. What I said was not a religious revival. That's not what I said. I said there must be a change from within, whether it occurs through spiritual reasons or religious reasons, or just as one German train saw a British train and people were moved by compassion, but the change occurred within. It is when that change occurs within us that we will get closer to this world that you're dreaming about. And you know, I'm for it. But it's nothing to do with size, or whether India has been cut across wrong borders or cut across hills, or whether Singapore is small and yet it's cruel, it hasn't produced anything. You know, I mean, it's nothing to do with sizes and people and how they're distributed. I think the change must come from within. I'm not waiting for, I didn't refer to a religious revival in the usual sense of the word. But I think the change must come from within. And I agree with you completely. I mean, Diana brought that change. You know, she struck a sort of a chord within.
But maybe Mr. Papworth is arguing that the human being in principle is good, isn't it?
I'm sure.
That's it. Yeah, that's the difference, I think.
All I'm saying is we need something for that goodness to show. In principle we are good,
and then,
but we don't see very much of it.
And then comes back my question about organizing. How do you want to organize this?
Well, that's everybody's responsibility. They can see. But, you know, I think that the categories here are a bit false in the sense that you say the change must come from within. Well, the change has come from within for countless people around the world. I mean, it doesn't happen to everybody all the time, all at once. Has it happened to you? What are you doing? You know, one can ask this question.
Sure.
Because this is what it comes down to. My impression is that my postbag, as the editor of a small magazine, of which you've got some descriptive matter there, end of wholesale, my impression is that there are countless people beavering away in different ways. You know, in Australia, they're lined up about the way they're trying to get some mining operations going and infringing on the rights of the Aboriginal people. In New Zealand, there's the same sort of pattern going on about the Maori people and their rights. You can see this going on around the world. And it's not a question of Maori and white people and so on. They're just people who are responding to a situation and doing it. And when you say the change must come from within, no, it's come. But, you know, you do have to accept, though, that, you know, psychologically, socially, and emotionally, and in other ways, things like the mass media are a force, are a power. I mean, if people weren't so gullible, they wouldn't be such a power. But sometimes not a change of morality is wanted, it's a change of head rather than a change of heart. I mean, the heart's okay, it's the head that's all wrong.
Maybe you have to put more of your heart in your head and your head in your heart. Well, I think we can call it an afternoon. Thank you very much, John. It was very
Thank you for your patience in listening.
Hope you have you back at some point in time.
Okay.
See you.
I look forward to company.